Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me once again for our day texts. We meet, as you know, Monday through Friday, as well as Saturdays, usually around 7 a.m., although we're just getting started a few minutes later this morning. But basically, I'd say between 6:30 and 7:30 is usually when we do our day texts. On Saturday, sometimes I change that to a little bit later in the morning. So always be sure to check the time. And if you haven't subscribed, you should do so you can get the notifications that will tell you, when the live streams are going on. And so with that in mind, we'll get right to the day texts. We work our way through the biblical books and letters, as well as other related texts and histories, so that we can better our knowledge and understanding of the God Jah, the one whom we believe he sent to save humankind, Jesus, and how we should treat each other. We believe the golden rule, or what Jesus taught, treating others the way we want to be treated, is the best way to live. That doesn't mean we don't make mistakes or that we don't have to deal with difficulties in relationships. It's just we recognize that the primary difficulty in all relationships today is our choice to do things that are against the ways we were made. And so when we do that, we have more difficulty. And that's why we try to follow Jah, because we know he's the one who made us, or that's our belief, based not just on the Bible, but on science and history outside of the Bible, which corroborates it. But we look at science, we can identify life is eternal because life is here now, and life can only come from existing life. And life, in our view, based on everything we see, is obviously intelligent. And so with those things in mind, we then look at history and we recognize that the God Jah is really the one who stands above all other gods or beings who were worshipped in the past, and whose the literature regarding him shows an activity that involves people as far back as Adam and Eve all the way through to Jesus. Whereas other religions and groups who have various gods cannot trace their history back to that point or provide a developed history based on archaeology like we find in the Bible. It's head and shoulders, maybe even upper torso above everything else as far as credibility and historicity. So we're reading the revelation that we believe was given to Jesus' beloved disciple John, that Jesus himself received by God, and that John then wrote to the Christian groups existing in his day. And as far as whether or not it's the actual John who wrote the Gospel of John, we don't get into questions like that here. You can't even prove that Luke wrote Luke's Gospel, right? You couldn't even prove that Paul wrote Paul's letters. Yet you have people who will take it upon themselves to introduce a question about who John is when it doesn't make any difference, because you wouldn't be able to prove it anyway. Yet we look to these texts not because of who allegedly wrote them, although that may be important, because if they walked or knew Jesus, then obviously that gives them better basis for writing what they wrote. But when it comes to texts like Revelation or even those texts, we just don't know. We don't know anything for sure from history. We weren't there. Yet we believe all kinds of things from history because of the people who were there and the things they wrote, and we can evaluate them and whether they're consistent with everything else. But when it comes to authorship, things like that, people who bring up those questions are directly violating the scripture, which tells us not to furnish questions for research. Okay, it's specific to genealogies and other things in that text, but you cannot answer the question of who John is. You cannot answer the question of who Luke is in terms of whether they really wrote what they wrote. So to get into the question shows a distraction in the person's mind from what is most important to what is really not important at all. But that's what people do today. I have someone who's obsessed with the first and the last. Can't even wait until we get to Revelation 22, and can't even take the time to read what I wrote almost 20 years ago, explaining the different uses of first and last, alpha and omega, beginning and end. So we have all kinds of people that we deal with, either as part of our shows or outside of our shows. But that's not what we're here for. Those kinds of people are not what I'm here for. Those people already know what to do, or they can find out our own the questions they ask, yet they ask them here for no real good reason at all. Just like Paul says, they just want to distract people. So you go research something that ultimately doesn't even matter. But what we're going to talk about today definitely matters, and I'm going to try to explain things to you in ways that will not require you to go do a bunch of extensive research just to get the basic message. All of us should and can and should do some extra research so we know the history and some of the details concerning some of the places and people mentioned in the Bible. But when it comes to trying to answer questions you can't answer, like who John is, I mean, it's just questions that are really silly to me, but that people ask for no good reason, just because they can. Remember, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And in fact, you should probably really consider whether you should do anything just because you can. There's all kinds of things I could do that I don't do because they're not good, or they don't make any sense, or they're not as important as the rest of the text, right? We don't want to spend our whole time trying to figure out who John is or the first and the last, when those are like the least promoted elements of these texts. In other words, it's not like the first and the last is such a clear presented teaching in every respect that it's highlighted above everything else. It specifically refers to Jesus as first and last in the context of death and resurrection, and in Codex A calls him firstborn, just like Paul does in Colossians 1:20, from the dead, in the same context. Whereas in 22, it's not that way at all. Not even close. Yet you have people trying to make a connection between those two, all so they can support a belief in God that has nothing to do with the Bible, right? Because Jesus in Revelation 3 calls God his God over and over again. The God of Isaiah would never do that. Yet people who promote the Trinity refuse to answer that question because they need the Trinity to answer it, and even that won't help them because Jesus is in a glorified state, not weakened at all, calling and confessing God as his God. So he's not God. He's only God in the sense that he stands for God, or that God appoints him to be God, and that he's the imprint of God's being. These are all biblical terms and concepts. Unlike the Trinity, which has nothing to do with what the Bible explicitly teaches, and which is contradicted by what it explicitly states. One God the Father, 1 Corinthians 8:6. That's all you need to know. Yet they confess even more than that, right? One God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They're out of line. They're out of the text, and we're going to get back to it and set them aside. Okay, Revelation 2, let's read verses 11 through 16. The one possessing an ear must listen to what the Spirit says to the gathering of Christians. Now, we know we all have ears, right? We talked about this last time. But like I just explained, you have people with ears and they don't hear. I have a person who's asking me questions that I answered 20 years ago. And that I answered in the very videos that the person asked a question about. And that I'll be discussing again when we get to the day text involving those texts. But they don't hear. They don't have an ear. They have two actual ears, but they do not have an ear to hear. They're deaf. Okay, you can't get through to them. It doesn't matter how many texts you show them. It doesn't matter if you show them John 10 and Jesus' use of gods for others who are not like him in the sense that he was sent by God, and so he can therefore even more so be called a God. They don't care about that. They care about the Trinity and what later councils and creeds told them was true. They don't have the intellectual capacity, 1 John 5:20. They need those creeds. They have to have the creeds, because without the creeds, there's no Trinity. The one who prevails will not likely be hurt because of the second death. The end of verse 11. Verse 12. That's the final part of the message to the Smyrnians that we read yesterday. Remember, I'm kind of trailing one text over to the next reading from each of the prior readings to the different gatherings of Christians. And I think by the time I'm done, you'll see why I do that. But it also just fits better with the groupings that I do. To the messenger of the Christians gathered in Pergamum, you must write, verse 12, the one who controls the long double-edged sword, from which there is no escape, says these things. So he's talking about Jesus. Jesus is now talking to us, but through the angels, right, that he sent to present to John these messages. Verse 13, I know where you live, where there is Satan's official seat or throne. You are holding on to my name, and you did not deny the belief about me, even during the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was put to death near you, where Satan dwells. Verse 14, however, I'm holding against you a few things, namely, you have people there sticking close to the teaching of Balaam, who instructed Balak to place an obstacle before the sons of Israel, eating food offered to idols and living open, obviously immoral lives. Verse 15, in a similar way, you have even those who are likewise sticking close to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Verse 16, so you must change your beliefs. But if you do not, swiftly I arrive, and I will fight against them using the sword of my mouth. All right, let's go back here for a few moments and take a look at some of these things. So, again, we're talking about prevailing and salvation. In verse 11, we talked about this before, consistent with Jesus' words, the one who endures to the end. Just because you start believing in Jesus and Jah and recognize the basis for the truth in the texts does not mean you are given salvation permanently. That is a non-biblical teaching, contradicted all over the place, and in particular by this text. You have to prevail. You have to accomplish and conclude your calling. You have to finish to get the prize. And then you will not likely be hurt by the second death. Otherwise, as Revelation elsewhere describes, you could have your name blotted out of the book of life. You may have it written in, but you can have it taken out. Now, some Christians don't want to hear that. That's fine. Let them believe what they want. Okay, if you have a Christian, a Calvinist, or someone else, and they're arguing with you about you not being able to lose your salvation, why are you wasting your time? They have the texts. They know the texts. You're not going to teach them anything. It's vanity on your part to think you have some special ability to convince these people who already are confessing Jesus Christ. Okay, so you have to let them be judged. The more time you spend with people like this, who claim they cannot lose their salvation, even though it says right here you can if you don't prevail, you're not going to make any progress with them, okay? You may think you are, but you are not. They have already been drawn to the Christ and already have had the opportunity to respond to his message. It's not about you and what you can show them, okay? Unless they just have no scriptural knowledge and believe something anyway, and they really do need you to show them something, you're wasting your time. And in fact, you're taking the easy way out. And it's on you. You're the one who's to blame if you are wasting your time with these kinds of people who deny what the text clearly states. And the reason a lot of people do this is they don't really want to do what we're supposed to do. They would much rather argue with people who already confess Jesus than try to go out and convince people to confess Jesus. So if you're someone and you're around a person who constantly asks questions of you, I get this all the time here, and I have to do it to some extent, right? Because it's a public channel and I do deal with biblical issues. But I mean, there's some people who know better and they do it anyway. They almost can't stop because they really don't believe, in my opinion. That's why they keep asking these questions. People with beliefs don't always ask questions. They're too busy believing, you know what I'm saying? They're too busy promoting belief and trying to prevail. These other people are just they're just in a trap, okay? They're in a debate trap. They're in a mind trap, and they just can't get out, or they won't let themselves out. And so the only thing they can do is just go on autopilot and keep asking the same questions. And you never make any progress. Now, look at verse 13. He talks about Satan's official seat or throne. And then he refers to the fact that Satan dwells there in Pergamum. So Pergamum is a city in Turkey that it sort of came to prominence in what they call the Seleucid period. The period, say, between 300 and the 1st century BCE. But then, eventually, Pergamum was gifted by the last ruler, who didn't have an heir, I believe, to Rome. And so Rome took over Pergamum. But it was a place that had extensive architecture that promoted these gods: Zeus, Aphrodite, Hera, Demetrius. All of these are gods that were prominently featured in Pergamum. In fact, if you look at the Museum of Berlin, you can do this online. Just type in the throne or the altar to Zeus in the Museum of Berlin. It was taken from Pergamum, and now it's in the Museum of Berlin. And so when it says Satan's official seat, it might be a reference to the fact that the great altar of Zeus was present in Pergamum. And of course, there were famous depictions of Zeus and other gods that you can see if you search online today at Pergamum. So probably that's why this location is referred to in that way. They were sort of known as the temple keepers of this time period for these gods. And so he references the fact that, they're in this place with all these gods and altars and all this false worship going on. And then in verse 14, so he says, first of all, he commends them, right? He says, you're holding on to my name, and you did not deny belief about me. Even though they were present in Pergamum, where Satan dwells, during the time of persecution when Antipas was put to death near them. They still held on to their belief. Now, could you imagine these people doing these things, withstanding persecution, living where Satan lives, and holding fast to Jesus' name, if they were arguing about their salvation? Do you think they could have existed where they're said to have existed, where Satan is dwelling and his throne is, and where all this false worship was going on and faithful Christians were being put to death, if they were arguing about the Trinity? If we don't stop this nonsense, and if we don't knock off the repeated questions and debates and waste of time, we are setting ourselves up for destruction. Okay? You Christians, and I use that in quotes, who repeatedly go around and ask these same questions without answering them yourself and promoting the belief. You who are repeatedly debating on these boards and undermining the faith of people who just want to follow Jesus, you are the cause of our division today. You are furthering Christian division and making us susceptible to attack because you refuse to believe and you can't stop arguing. Prostitutes and tax collectors are going ahead of you people who constantly debate and divide the body of Christ. Prostitutes and tax collectors are going ahead of you into the kingdom of God. Verse 14, I hold this against you, though. So they were in Pergamum, Satan's throne, all this false worship, Christians being put to death. They're still faithful, not arguing about salvation or the Trinity, obviously. But he's holding these things against them. There are people there sticking close to the teaching of Balaam, who instructed Balak to put an obstacle before the sons of Israel, eating food offered to idols and living open, obviously immoral lives. And so if you're familiar with the account of Balaam and Balak and the sons of Israel in Numbers, you know that Balaam was one who was sort of secluded in a way, but used by Jah at a time probably to direct the affairs of the people surrounding those areas before the Israelites had come. Because remember, Jah works through whoever he wants. And he will provide, especially during a time prior to the coming of the Son, when you have all these different arrangements and kingdoms and figures. So Balaam was one who worshiped Jah. He offered sacrifices to Jah in ways that Jah accepted, and he communicated to him during this time before Moses brought the Israelites to this point and before they took possession of the land. And so Balak, when he saw the Israelites coming and the great number of them and became afraid, and he saw what they did to the Amorites, the text says, he then petitioned Balaam to curse them, because he was aware that Balaam had this relationship with Jah, or a god who Balaam recognized as Jah, that was able to do things. And he would listen to Balaam or respond or tell him his will. And so Balak went to Balaam multiple times, and each time Balaam was unable to curse them, and he ended up blessing them or proclaiming their future according to Jah's word. But it seemed, the text indicates that basically what ended up happening was that Balaam and Balak basically allowed the women of Moab who were worshiping these false gods to get involved with the Israelites. And the Israelites chose to do that as well, some of them, not all of them. And so in this way, Balaam was able to appease Balak in the sense that he gave him the means by which he could begin to stumble the sons of Israel by contaminating them with the false worship of Baal. The text refers to the fact that the Israelites and the women of Moab that they were with were sacrificing to the Baal of Peor. So, and then of course you had the one account where the Israelite man took the Moabite woman and then it even passed in front of Moses and all the others, and then of course the two of them were killed in their tent, because Moses said that every single Israelite who was sacrificing to Baal should be killed, and thousands were killed. So the false worship and the immorality that was brought to the Israelites by Balaam and Balak and the inhabitants of Moab, or the people of Moab, this was a stumbling block for them. So you have the people of Jah coming through the wilderness out of Egypt, establishing themselves. And then you had this. You had Balak trying to use Balaam to curse them, and then ultimately allowing his people to become involved with the Israelites to the extent that it then created uncleanness among Jah's people in ways where many of them, they ended up killing themselves. Right? So this is a warning example to us. The Israelites, by choosing to disobey Moses and Jah and go after these women who were sacrificing to these false gods, they ended up killing each other. Well, that's what we're doing today. We have these apologetic whack jobs who can't stop arguing. It's impossible, it seems to me. They're only really involved in Christianity, it seems to me, to argue with other people. So it's just an ongoing attempt to promote themselves, really, or to reinforce what they don't actually believe, but they want to believe, so they keep arguing about it. Either way, they end up creating fights with other people who do believe, who recognize the good reasons that we have, and that's enough. We don't need to answer all these other questions that you can't even answer anyway. They're causing us to destroy ourselves. They're following after these other false religions, whether they're false Christian religions like Calvinism that teaches things that have nothing to do with Jesus or the Bible, and who promote individuals like John Calvin, who obviously went way beyond legal authority in terms of the punishment he gave to others. And he obviously was a liar too. He taught things like the Trinity and all kinds of false teachings today, just like we see today. So we have the same people, these Trinitarians and others, who are presenting these false doctrines, right? We know they try to use it to deal with monotheism, but it's not in the text. Okay, let's just get that out of the way once more. It's not in the text, and it's contradicted by clear statements of faith and Jesus' own use of the word gods and God. So it's not even something to entertain, really, unless you are a non-biblical Christian committed to councils and creeds, or maybe someone like John Calvin. You're not going to be committed to Jesus in the right way and come to the Trinity. It's not there. Or you're not going to come up with these weird ideas that you can never lose your salvation. It's right there. Okay? We don't need to argue over it. If you need to argue over it, you don't believe it. Because you're just falling victim to someone who doesn't. And instead of helping other people who need you, you just argue with those who don't. And so who needs you, right? I guess no one. You're not really good for anything but arguing with someone who's not going to change. So avoid all of those things. And I have to tell myself this repeatedly, because otherwise we're going to encounter people like Balak and Balaam, some of whom may not want to hurt us, some of whom may want to hurt us, but they'll work together either way to stumble us, right? They'll argue and they'll continue to present questions for research rather than promote faith and belief in the one God the Father. So we should avoid them at all cost. And or otherwise you may be stumbled. You may end up following after these false gods and doing things because of your argument and debates. It's destabilizing you and you're not able to grow in a healthy way. And eventually that's just going to take a toll on you. And you're going to end up doing things that these people who are arguing with you about either do, or that because you no longer have the faith needed to proceed, you'll succumb to, because you've allowed yourself to question things that are based on the best available reasons in ways that you shouldn't have to. Right? Once you know something's based on the best available reasons, well, unless there's some better reason, right? Just because someone throws out a reason, what, all of a sudden you got to reset everything? Oh, I got to review everything all over again now. No, that's retarded. Unless there's just like, and what's missing, by the way? Have you not read the Bible? Are you not aware of the words in the text? Is there some missing passage you think you're going to find? I mean, it's ridiculous, right? There's nothing else there that you need. Yet they just continue to argue and ask these questions like we're missing something. There's something there. If we find it, we'll know. No. You already have what you need. We read that in the last text. We think we don't have. We think we're poor. We're not. We have more than we need. In the same way, they were sticking close to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. So we talked about them before and how they were doing basically similar things to what you see here in the account of Balaam and Balak, involving food sacrifice to idols and living open, obviously immoral lives, getting involved with people of the nations. Remember, if they're sacrificing to Baal, these would be things likely involved with foods offered to idols in the context of Balaam and Balak in this text from Revelation 2:14. So in the same way, the Nicolaitans were doing these things and teaching people to eat things offered to idols in ways that were against what the apostles had said and Jesus, in the sense that you wouldn't want to stumble other people, even if you were doing something that you felt right in your own conscience toward God doing. We still don't go putting it before other people like Balaam and Balak did here. So if we have our own choice and view on a certain thing, that doesn't mean we go stumbling other people just because we think we understand it in a way that our conscience allows us to do something to Jah. That doesn't mean you then go promoting that thing if you know it's something your brother and sister will be stumbled over. Right? You do it with those who either do it or you do it on your own if it's something that's going to bother other people. And you certainly don't promote it among the congregations so that you destabilize people who may be living where the throne of Satan is, have Christians being persecuted all around them, and you want to argue about salvation. You want to argue about who the first and last is, even though he tells you who his God is in Revelation 3. Instead of helping these people deal with the satanic influence that's all around us, and the people who are being persecuted by other people who just want to pleasure themselves at our expense, instead of helping those people in those ways, the apologetic nut jobs go around and make it even more difficult for us by asking us questions that we've already answered in ways that will allow us to show faith, belief. Okay, when you go out and drive in your car today, are you going to start questioning whether you're going to live or die? Well, you might, right? Isn't there a good chance you might live or die? Yet how many of you actually think about that as you're driving? Well, so why do you go around in faith about Jesus and God and ask all these questions? That's just dumb. You're supposed to be believing in the same way, at least, that you're driving. So if you don't even have the same extent of faith about these things that you do when it comes to driving, give me a break. Stop pretending, okay? All right, let me take a look at some of the questions. Okay. Let me just read a few. So it's Shauna Stone says, I've had the hardest time to stop the Watchtower, to stay off my Facebook. I try not to get too hurt or angry there. I know. What I'm telling you now, I'm dealing with myself. I have to deal with people in ways like I was talking about with the first and last. I mean, I've got people who can watch my videos where I give the exact answer to the question they're asking. Or where I've written an article 20 years ago and I give them the link. They won't read the article. They won't watch the videos, or they don't get it. And then they'll just ask the question all over again. And so what does that make me do? I either have to ignore the person and hope everyone else realizes I already answered it, or it's been in writing for 20 years. Or I have to answer it and make sure that the people who may not have the time to read or watch those things realize I've already done the videos and written an article that answers the question, yet this person who claims to believe in Jesus asks it anyway. See what I'm saying? They don't care. They don't want the information. They want to stop you from believing. Probably because they don't believe. Or they believe you just believe wrongly, but they're not willing to look at your evidence. And so they ignore it and just ask the same question anyway. Right? That's disrespectful, isn't it? Wouldn't you say it's disrespectful for someone to repeatedly ask you the same question that you've already answered for 20 years? Or in the very most recent videos? That's disrespectful, right? They do it anyway, and they claim to believe in God while they're doing it. See? While they're disrespecting you. They're claiming they believe in the right Jesus. Really, really weird. And other questions. So speaking of the Trinity, so he's talking... So it looks like we have other people who on YouTube maybe doing videos and non-Trinitarian and dealing with this. Yeah, that'll happen. The Trinitarian nut jobs, the ones who are apologetic nut jobs, they're not going to stop. I mean, there are Trinitarian Christians who don't get into the apologetic weirdness that exists today. And I say weirdness because it's so excessive. It has nothing at all to do with what we read in the Bible or how the early Christians were like. They're just groups that like to fight and argue and debate in direct violation of several biblical texts that say not to do that or not to spend your time doing those things. But that's all they have. Whether it's the Watchtower witnesses who want to argue against the Trinity, or whether it's the Trinitarians who want to argue against one God the Father, biblical teaching. They just, for whatever reason, they've either grown up in association with these traditions, like many of us did at one point, or they have a family or others who are close to them and believe these things, and it's just hard to not go with them. There are things like that that make it difficult to see evidence. So we do have to be sympathetic to some extent, but that doesn't mean we then allow them to feel like it's okay, right? We just let them go. We cannot change everyone, nor should we try to. Our goal is to present the message, the information that people who are in need, not the ones who have all of the information and just don't believe. Why would you spend your time with someone like that? I believe it's because that same person doesn't believe. And so you have really just two people who don't believe arguing with each other, right? Because if they did believe, they wouldn't be arguing with each other, at least not on purpose, right? I mean, you can find yourself either responding to a question or getting involved in a discussion, but two Christians who believe, if they realized they didn't believe the same about God in a way like with Trinitarians and non-Trinitarians, and they just weren't going to resolve that, they wouldn't keep arguing like for the rest of their lives, or even for like a long, long time. Not ones who really believe, right? Because they would be motivated to get to other people who are not yet aware of the things that the one opposite them clearly knows or has the text. But again, it's vanity that keeps people in these arguments. They either think they can change the person, or they themselves are looking for reasons to change or not to change, and the argument and the continuing debate helps them to satisfy what they're looking for in that way, but they never find it because they're looking for something that's not there, because everything that actually should be looked for is there, and it's not enough for them, right? They want more. They want that missing text. They want that missing manuscript. Where is it, right? Well, it's all right here. There's no mystery, and you just have to read it. Every now and then you get a translation issue. Big deal. Is that your whole life in ministry? Translation issues? Give me a break. All right, so I think we did a good job today. Oh, last verse, let's reinforce that. So you must change your beliefs. If you don't, swiftly I arrive, and I will fight against them using the sword of my mouth. So if we're persecuted by these kinds of people, whether it's individuals like Balak and Balaam, who in Balaam's case served Jah or was approved by him in some sense, but nonetheless succumbed to other individuals like Balak to damage those whom God approved. See, you can have different personalities in people who may not always seem so evil and who are involved in the things that we're involved with in ways that we're like, well, okay, maybe we should talk about that. Well, no, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should be talking about the things Jesus told us to talk about versus arguing nonstop about things like salvation or the nature of God. Just read the text. I think it's clear to us in almost every instance, or where it isn't, we can discuss it in the context and come up with the proper understanding. I don't think any of this is really unclear. And I don't see any reason why Christians should continuously be arguing over these things. That's not the example we're shown in the Bible, and that's not what we're told to do. We're told to overturn the deep things of Satan and to fight against lies. That's true. But once you've done it, you don't keep doing it. Unless you're just not interested in helping people who are not lying. Which is it going to be? Are you going to spend your time with liars and people who confuse others more so than those who are confused and in need of help? If so, probably you're closer to Balaam and Balak than you are to Jesus Christ. All right, so that's a good morning text for us here. We're working our way through Revelation. We'll be doing open session this Sunday, and I'm going to introduce it with a topic related to blood, the use of blood, or maybe the watchtower and blood. Not still working on how I'm going to do that. But we'll keep working our way through Revelation, and I hope this information is of use to you. That's my goal. My goal, if nothing else, is to make sure you are not confused and that the things that are clear you understand so you can proceed, so you can prevail, not so you get stymied by a question because someone refuses to follow the text and research something on their own. You want to research something? It's real easy. You type in a word in this thing we have called an internet browser, whole bunch of stuff comes up. And you can look at it and determine whether or not it's credible or not. You don't need to burden other people with your own questions if you can answer them yourself. Okay, we're good talking here and coming up with information, but these same questions over and over again, you Christians, quote unquote, who continue to do these things, you apologetic nut jobs, remember these words: prostitutes and tax collectors are going ahead of you in the kingdom of God.